I'd like to make the claim for being the closest participant because my office is 3 minutes that way. In an international conference, I don't know if that's something to be proud of. And the other thing not to be proud of is that I'm not a procurement expert, but I probably don't need to say that. That will become apparent very quickly. So all I'd like to do, very briefly, is to share a few thoughts from the perspective, I suppose, of the third sector supply side. Just to give a bit of context and then talk about some of the provisions in the new directives/regulations as implemented here in the UK of particular interest to third sector. And I'm talking predominantly about services contracts and often quite low value contracts. The third sector as a term is a Welsh Government term, and I'm just using it for convenience to talk about charities, social enterprises, not-for-profit groups, NGOs and so on. There are around 33,000 third sector organisations here in Wales, from small, entirely voluntary community groups to large multi-million pound household name charities. And the vast majority, of course, are those very small groups, but we estimate there could be up to about 3,000 third sector organisations capable of delivering public services under contract, but that's not the current market, that's the potential market, I would say. In terms of Muppets and Gazelles, I would suggest possibly that some of the social enterprise activity, and I would say this, wouldn't I, might be classified as a gazelle. That's, I think, the area we're talking about. I also wanted to say, by way of context, I started my career working for a grant funder. And now I'm working in public services policy. I've almost had to become acquainted with procurement, so I'm relatively recent arrival at the procurement party, but I'm enjoying myself. Now I'm here. And in many ways, my own journey into procurement mirrors that of third sector organisations, particularly in Wales, because 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, the majority of income to the third sector in Wales came from grants. 5 years ago, the majority of income came from contracts, a fundamental shift, one which happened very quickly and which brought some profound cultural changes for these organisations, particularly the business of securing these contracts, competitive tendering. On a UK-wide basis, that happened slightly earlier, but it is still relatively recent. In reality, of course, what happened is that there were grants, and everyone was clear about that. Then there were grants with these things called service level agreements, which started to introduce performance standards and contractual language and started to feel an awful lot like payments for services, and this is where our legal friends get very twitchy. And then organisations found that they were tendering competitively for things which absolutely were contracts. But the lack of clarity is a point I'll come back to. Mostly the organisations I'm talking about will be earning income through delivering public services contracts for those categories of service formerly categorised as Part B and now part of the new light touch regime. And of course, we would argue that third sector organisations do have a lot to offer to these types of contracts. They're often much closer to communities and service users than their statutory partners, and can, if they are gazelles, I suppose, offer a flexible and often innovative approach to service delivery. And this is something recognised in national government policy and rhetoric. But for those organisations more familiar with a grant culture, the prospect then of this new light touch regime seemed attractive. Promise of more flexibility, less bureaucracy, greater scope for local determination. All of this did sound very promising. But as others have said, be careful what you wish for. So will the light touch regime really lead to this greater flexibility, more appropriate or proportionate processes, a genuine partnership approach as has been advocated? Or will the lack of the heavy hand of legislation mean even greater disparity, greater confusion? And what about the implications of the things about which the regulations are silent, things below that new higher threshold? I think there are also interesting opportunities in the area of reserved contracts, as has been touched on. And this widening of the definition from disabled to disabled and disadvantaged, and the lowering of the threshold from 50 to 30%, I think is potentially significant. Now, we've just started doing a bit of market analysis, so I wish I had the figures available, but I do think this is a number of third sector organisations, and indeed a number of other SMEs could fit into this category. But again, there were opportunities in the formula regulations for reserved contracts, albeit to a lesser degree. And here in Wales, a lot of work was done to promote these organisations, and yet take-up was very poor. So what will be the difference this time? There are other opportunities offered by the directives, regulations as implemented. The provisions for joint bidding are very welcome. We're supportive of that, and the provisions for reserving contracts for certain categories of services as well could lead to opportunities to build capacity, to pilot things, to try things. As has been discussed, we might say broadly that the narrative about procurement is changing towards an even greater recognition of social policy considerations, which of course we welcome. But my point is that to make the most of these opportunities, they're there, but they need to be implemented. And the benefits will only be realised if the opportunities are taken. And making most of the opportunities means viewing the regulations as an enabling framework and using a mindset that asks not what can't we do, but what can we do. The other thing I just wanted to say is about procurement practice. And there are, and we've heard of many good and excellent examples of procurement practice here in Wales and in the UK, and the awards tonight celebrate that. But I would be doing a disservice to our members if I didn't talk and share some of their less positive experiences as well. And just this week I've heard from 3 of our members who have highlighted disproportionate and inappropriate processes, timescales, paperwork wholly unrelated to the scale and nature of contracts, and still this business of outright confusion between grants and contracts. There was one local authority, not to be named, who did an analysis of its funding agreements with third sector bodies. A certain proportion were grants, they're happy, they're grants. A certain proportion were contracts, and yet the majority were historical. They did not know the nature of and it's no one's interest to have that lack of clarity. Too often, though, I think the issue has been an overriding principle, and this has been touched on certainly today, of kind of extreme risk aversion because of certain fears. But I would argue for these particular types of services I'm talking about today, particularly social care services, the greatest risk is that vulnerable people, children, young people and adults, don't receive the high-quality services that they deserve. And developing and delivering these types of services does require a partnership approach. It does require engagement, conversation with all stakeholders. Many of the third sector organisations I work with do blame procurement regulations for the lack of, or for the erosion, I suppose, of dialogue with public bodies. But they're not completely irreconcilable. So I think we're back to, and I know this was discussed yesterday, pre-procurement market dialogue and the provision which explicitly enables this. So I would urge all parties to avail themselves of this opportunity. And I do think this is where we should invest our energies and our efforts. And if we get this right, the rest might follow. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much indeed.